Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. Hello again, we're going to get started in just 1 minute. Hello, this webinar is being recorded. Your phone line is muted. A link to the recording and slides will be made available after the webinar. Hello again, welcome to our webinar on the COVID-19 slide and the future of summer learning. My name is Leslie Gabay-Swanston. I'm the Director of Program and Systems Quality at the National Summer Learning Association. Here's a quick overview of our webinar today. I'll share a little bit more about NSLA for those who aren't familiar before we get here from our expert panelists. Then we'll have some time for questions from the audience before we're wrapping up with some announcements about upcoming webinars, events, and how we'll follow up on this particular topic area. If you have a question for our speakers as we're going along, please put them in the Q&A box. The National Summer Learning Association is the only national nonprofit exclusively focused on addressing the achievement and opportunity gaps by increasing access to summer learning opportunities. NSLA's goal is to increase nationwide the number of high-quality summer learning programs. To achieve this goal, NSLA recognizes and disseminates what works, offers expertise and support for programs and communities, and advocates for summer learning as a solution for equity and excellence in education. NSLA's work is driven by the belief that all children and youth deserve high-quality summer learning experiences that will help them succeed in college, career, and life. Core to our work is the recognition that high-quality summer learning programs work and have been shown to improve reading and math skills, school attachment, motivation, and relationships with adults and peers. We know that summer is a time of great inequity for young people, and we believe that promoting and supporting summer opportunities is a way to address this. This goes beyond the summer learning that's in our name. We also want to see programs and communities addressing access to other resources like meals and youth employment. Summer is a time for innovation and exploration. Without some of the constraints of the school year, kids are able to try different ways of learning and interact with other adults and peers that they might not otherwise. It is also a time for innovation for adults, whether that's opportunities for professional development, trying out new teaching methods, or exploring new partnerships. Today, we will explore the impact of COVID-19 on academic achievement. I'm happy to welcome our first presenters from the Northwest Evaluation Association. Megan Kuhfeld seeks to understand students' trajectories of academic and social emotional learning and the school and neighborhood influences that promote optimal growth. Megan's work covers a range of topics, including longitudinal growth modeling, achievement gaps, and summer learning loss. It has been featured in Education Week, the Los Angeles Times, the Journal of Research on Educational Effectiveness, and Applied Psychological Measurement. She completed a PhD in quantitative methods in education and a master's degree in statistics from the University of California, Los Angeles. Megan also works at a nonprofit policy institute, Policy Institute, Child Trends, the Population Research Center at the University of Texas at Austin, and CREST, where she provided psychometric support to the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium. Beth Tarasawa leads NWEA's research teams, the Center for School and Student Progress, and Collaborative and collaborative for student growth. She plays a key role in building collaborations with universities, foundations, and school districts to produce rigorous and accessible educational policy research. Beth's research focuses on issues related to educational equality, particularly those concerning social class, race, and linguistic diversity. Her work has been featured by PBS's NewsHour, Children's Institute, the Hechinger Report, The Atlantic, Education Week, and New America. She also teaches in the College of Education at Portland State University. She earned her PhD and MA in the sociology of education with a concentration in education policy at Emory University. So with that, I will turn things over to Beth and Megan.
Great, thanks so much, Leslie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. I thought I'd give just a quick overview about NWEA to set some context before Megan describes our current research, our most recent research. NWEA is a research-based, not-for-profit organization that supports students and educators primarily through our assessments that measure academic growth and proficiency, as well as a portfolio of professional learning offerings that provide insights to help educators tailor instruction. We've been around for a bit more than 40 years, and we're most known for our flagship assessment measures of academic progress, or MAP growth, which is primarily used in grades K through 8 in math, reading, and science. Leslie, I might need you to advance the slides, it looks like. Great, thank you. We typically assess students in fall, winter, and spring, and I mention these details because they're important in considering how we measure students during the academic year, as well as measuring potential losses and gains during the out-of-school time. But what does it mean to be a not-for-profit assessment organization or in the assessment space? It means NWEA also reinvests its data to address critical questions in the field of education. And we hope to reach a range of audiences. Those include practitioners and school leaders, policymakers, as well as the academic community. We have two distinct divisions on our research team, but in some, our work spans a range of educational measurement and policy issues, including achievement gaps, assessment, engagement, social and emotional learning, and innovations in how we measure student learning. Core to our mission is building research partnerships with universities, think tanks, grant funding agencies, and other stakeholders to expand the insights drawn from our growth research database, which is one of the most extensive in the world. And we've leveraged that database for this particular project. So as COVID pandemic closed schools across the nation, education systems are scrambling to meet the needs of schools and families and 55 million students. The economic impacts and trauma of recent events will also have far-reaching effects that will likely exacerbate long-standing opportunity gaps. An extended time out of school will most certainly affect student achievement, and that impact is hard to estimate given all the aspects of COVID on schooling and society. At the same time, while it's difficult to speculate on what missing months of school may mean for achievement, research on seasonal learning and summer learning loss can offer some insights on the potential impacts of this extended pause in classroom instruction when students return to school. My colleague Megan Kuhfeld, a leading expert in the space of seasonal learning, will elaborate on our most recent research study and projections.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be talking to you all today, and especially because this work that we're going to be presenting today actually has its roots in summer learning loss. So just to give a little context before I kind of dive into these complicated plots that are in front of you, as Beth said, our MAP growth assessment that we provide at NWEA has been used recently by me and others to study summer learning loss because its design allows for the measurement of growth both during the school year from fall to winter to spring, but using the spring and fall assessments, we can also examine summer learning loss, and it provides a really great opportunity to do that in math and reading and across a number of grades. So when we, were all of a sudden in February and March faced with this situation where schools were closing, states were closing down schools all the way across the country, we thought about what we could do to kind of contribute to our understanding of what the situation might look like. And we knew that we had data on what typical growth might look like in a school year, as well as what learning rates look like across grades and subjects during the summer. So we decided to kind of combine that knowledge with these current situations, the COVID-19 crisis that we're in, to really think about kind of in a worst case scenario for, this period of time where schools are physically closed, classroom instruction has moved online, or, slowly moved online, what the learning impacts could possibly be. So really this really comes down to kind of has its roots in summer learning. So I'm going to kind of go through these plots. They're pretty complicated, so I'm going to try to break it down for you a little bit. This is from the brief that Beth mentioned that we put out about a month ago. And what we were doing in the brief was really trying to think through possible scenarios of what this learning could look like. And so to start that thought process, we decided to plot what the kind of typical growth trajectory may look like for a student in a given grade. So these solid lines that you're seeing starting in September 1st and going through the September 1st of the next school year is depicting what the average growth trajectory for a student, in this case in reading, may look like from 3rd to 8th grade. So as you see, it starts in September and it goes up as we would expect while kids are in school and are learning kind of in different grade levels. It's going up in the earlier grades, it's going up faster than in some of the middle school grades, but and then, during a normal school year, it would keep going up all the way through June 15th, kind of an average school year end date. And then, as we know, summer learning often does not, it reflects a slowdown or a drop. So what we see in these plots is that we see the kind of the typical going up through the end of the school year, and you see that inflection point on the typical last day where students start losing ground during the summer. So that's what we might expect in a typical school year. Though we all know what we're experiencing currently is not a typical school year. There's a little bit of variation across states, but for the most part, schools started closing down somewhere in mid-March. And there have been very different kind of rollouts of virtual learning, rollouts of instruction, handing out a device, providing of school meals. There's been all kinds of different treatments across the country as some school districts were kind of better prepared, better resourced to be able to start that process. But given we know that, we know very little about virtual learning and how effective it's going to be during this period, and we know some school districts were pretty slow to be able to pull all their resources together to figure out what that would look like, we were concerned that, for many students, this might actually be a period where instead of getting the normal gains they would be making, which you can see between the school closure and the typical last day, those solid lines are going up, they may actually be slowing down their learning or losing learning at a rate that we might expect and that we've seen previously when kids are out of school. So when we refer to COVID slide, what our projections are actually showing is what learning may look like if it was resembling a typical summer. And that's this dotted line that you're seeing here. Of course, we don't actually expect this will be the case for all students. We expect there to be some students who are probably doing fine. They have parents at home that can reinforce learning and go through the materials with them, and instruction being provided by school districts. But we also know that there are huge inequalities in our country in terms of who has access to internet, who has access to a parent who's able to support learning at home instead of being off doing an essential job. And so we provided these projections in part to be able to kind of provide some data-driven estimates of what the variability of these losses could look like, as well as what the variability in possible outcomes for students are. So even though you don't really see it in this plot, we imagine that there's actually, many different outcomes that are going to be observed when each grade. Some students are likely to show the losses shown in these dotted lines. Some students potentially could be showing even larger losses due to all the traumatic events that are happening, in families, in neighborhoods and communities across the country. And some students will probably be fine, but we wanted to put these projections out there so that we could really start thinking, okay, how bad could this look? And how do we get prepared for this school year and for next school year? One of the big findings that we see in these results is that the reading losses are actually not as bad as we might see in math. So if we want to flip to the math results slide. So what we see in math is actually both kind of steeper, more linear gains during the school year, but also larger losses during the summer. So you can see particularly in some of the 4th and 5th grade results, which is this blue and green line, those summer loss rates are fairly steep. And what you see is that the gap, basically the triangle that's forming between where kids should have been gaining throughout the rest of March, April, May, and the beginning of June, is all of a sudden this large divergence where instead of continuing to make those gains, they may be losing ground at a pretty steep rate. And so we're particularly worried about the impacts on math. We know that math is a subject that many families don't feel as prepared to help their kids with. They may have learned math differently than kids are being taught math these days. It may be a subject that parents struggled with themselves or they don't feel as supported. It may also be a subject where the families really feel that teachers are best suited to do this. So one of the big takeaways from our results was really that we should be really thinking about how we can support math learning both during a typical summer as well as while schools are closed, because that's something we could see even more consequential losses for during the school year. And we, I think, that's basically it for these findings. I know we'll probably have a lot of questions. We do have some new plots that if anyone is interested, they're available from the NWEA website that really try to show the variability we may expect. But for the most part, I think these projections give you a good sense of what we could be looking at when students return to school. And so now I know Beth is now going to give some policy recommendations and thoughts about what we could do given this possible large academic impact we may be facing.
Thanks, Megan. That's really helpful. And I'll go ahead and answer one of Faith's questions. She was asking kind of about the magnitude of losses. And so when we were estimating these, we used the term typical learning gain. So we're comparing how kids may end up in the fall with how they would potentially progress under typical conditions. And so for reading, we estimate those to be about 70%. So kids would return in the fall with about 70% of the learning gains we'd see under normal conditions. For fall, that's closer to 50%. And as Megan points out, in some grades, nearly a full grade behind, to just give some context of magnitude. And I'll go ahead and talk a bit about our policy recommendations. And so Megan, my CEO, Chris Minnick, and myself, we've sort of been on this virtual roadshow, if you will, and the audiences have varied. So in some cases, it's been in the research space and media interviews, but also we've been presenting these findings to our district partners. And I think those are some of the most telling meetings that we've had. And so I'll talk a little bit about those recommendations or considerations that we've had for our various audiences. So the first when we talk about is how we discuss the federal investments and flexibilities. And so we know federal relief funds will be making their way to state education agencies, LEAs, and government offices to help meet emergency needs. So we recommend districts work alongside their state governing bodies to plan most effectively for those funds. Next, we stress the importance of making up lost instructional time. So any options for additional instruction time are essential to slow or mitigate the slide. So that includes things like summer school or extended school days, year-round schooling options that could all be considered. We also believe additional summer learning programs, including libraries and existing state supports across the nation, should be funded now for both reading and math initiatives. Next, we also talk about creating clear and strategic restart plans. And that's been interesting just to see also our partner districts respond. So for these first couple months, it's been really triage. How do we get lunches to kids? How do we get how do we get devices or loan out devices? And really meeting kind of students' basic needs. I think now people are starting to come out and start thinking about what does that restart look like? Is that the fall? Is it some kind of hybrid of brick and mortar and virtual? We're not really sure kind of what that crystal ball might suggest, but I think preparing multiple scenarios is what we're seeing our districts now turn to. We also know that educators will need data to guide curriculum and instruction to support students, particularly to target resources and the intention for communities, those that are most impacted by COVID closures. Any additional data to provide valuable information in times of disruption and uncertainty will be really necessary, as well as implement measures to identify where students are both academically and emotionally. We also recommend, knowing, we're kind of our wheelhouse is in the academic space, that this really brings into so much relief the importance of social-emotional learning and to triage trauma and prioritize those students with the most severe needs, as well as the learning gaps. But detailed plans really need to support students from special populations, including guidance for accessibility and accommodations, specific strategies for supporting English language learners or families experiencing homelessness or other historically marginalized subpopulations. Third, we really push to surround kids with learning outside the classroom, so encouraging our local government agencies to engage with folks such as Parks and Rec to provide funding and enrichment programs and quality free learning program for kids, ideally paired with meals and nutritional programs that have engaging learning opportunities. And then finally, we really recommend supporting the demand for distance learning as a catalyst to create more blended learning options, and providing funding infrastructure for distance learning, including platforms, technology, connectivity, and training for practitioners. So in sum, we've been speaking to a variety of agencies, of government organizations, of universities, researchers, as well as our K-12 partners. But we're really, working on this recovery effort. So when schools reopen, recovery begins, we can use what we've learned in this crisis and expand on these learnings to hopefully prepare for the future.
And if I could just add one more thing, I realized I kind of launched into the results of our study without giving a little bit of the backstory. And I saw one of the Q&As kind of asked about where this data came from. So I realized I should have shared these results, these trajectories we are displaying come from analyzing data from about 5 million students who took the MAP growth assessment during the 2017-18 school year. So those plots you were seeing are model-based estimates based on real student data showing growth from fall, winter, and spring based on how many months kids have been in school. And then our summer learning loss estimates come from estimating with those 5 million children following students from the spring of 2018 to the fall of 2018. And then when we project the COVID slide, it's based on the summer learning rates that we observed in 2018 projected from March to September. So that they are real, the projections are based on real data, but they are projections. We're not actually collecting data at this time while schools are closed.
Okay, thank you. Next, we're going to have a little bit of discussion. I'd like to introduce 2 more people to our panel. Matthew Boulay is the founder of the National Summer Learning Association. A former elementary school teacher in New York City, Dr. Boulay earned a PhD in sociology and education from Columbia University's Teachers College and was recently named one of the 25 most influential people in out-of-school time learning. A former Marine and veteran of the war in Iraq, Dr. Boulay is a leader in the push for a new GI Bill and continues to advocate on behalf of veterans. Karl Alexander is Executive Director of the Thurgood Marshall Alliance. He retired from Johns Hopkins University in 2014 after 42 years on the sociology faculty, including 15 years as department chair. He presently holds appointments at Hopkins as a John Dewey Professor Emeritus, a Sociology Academy Professor, and by courtesy Professor in the School of Education. Dr. Alexander received his PhD in sociology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He serves on the board of NSLA and is the co-editor of the Summer Slide, What We Know and Can Do About Summer Learning Loss. Before I turn things over to Matthew, I'll just say a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and the slides will be shared afterwards. And also, if you have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A box so we can keep track of them. And with that, I'll hand things over to Matthew.
Great, thank you, Leslie. Hello to everyone out there in Zoom land. And Beth, Megan, and Carl, thanks for joining us. We had a number of questions submitted by folks prior to the webinar as they were registering. So we'll start with a few of those. And then I see a lot of folks are sending questions into the chat box or the Q&A. So we'll get to those in a minute. But I want to start, Beth and Megan first, and then I'll ask Carl. Digital divide is top of mind for everybody these days. Does your data, shed any light on how summer learning loss in the past might have been affected by the digital divide? Any inferences we can draw out now?
Yeah, so we haven't actually previously examined summer loss by, whether or not families have computers or internet at home, but we imagine that this is definitely a driving factor. It seems to be something that is really increasing inequality, both just during normal school time when many increasingly homework and other things are happening online, as well as during this period of time where we're switching over to virtual instruction and many families lack the broadband connection, the devices to be able to do kind of check in with their teachers, meet up with peers, and do the activities the schools are requesting of them. So we don't have hard data on this, but we know that there's a big digital divide in our country and that it's something that is likely to increase inequalities during this period.
And Beth, you mentioned in one of your suggested points some blended learning as a possible intervention. Is that partly about overcoming the digital divide?
Yeah, we've been working with the Center for Reinventing Public Education, who's doing some work to track what districts are doing, as well as at the school building level. So trying to figure out not only what technology and instruction is being pushed out, but also what other metadata can we get to capture the usage or how often kids are logging on or interacting. So I'm hoping, I also think this is pushing the ivory tower a bit to be more nimble in our research and not wait for 3 years to come out with findings, that we're going to have to, bring some evidence to bear, ideally, short term, right when kids are back in session in fall, to understand kind of magnitudes, and also to think really tactically about what's working under what conditions and for what populations, so we can scale recovery efforts. And folks like Doug Harris and folks that are out at Tulane have often talked about this in parallels to Katrina and what lessons learned and how long that took to recover. It took a couple years for those students to make up many of the gains or many of the losses that they had seen in the New Orleans parishes. And so I think that we're going to be seeing some similar lessons there, and what data can we bring to bear.
Yeah.
Hey, sorry, I bounced off. I think my Xbox son kicked me off of my computer. I apologize.
Yeah, we got you loud and clear. And Karl, do you want to jump in on the digital divide question? And maybe it's useful to just sort of preface before I turn it over to Karl. Karl's work, the Beginning School Study, begun way back in the 1980s, long before there was this digital divide, really found similar patterns of school year gains and summer losses. And one was one of the earliest studies to establish this pattern. So all of us stand on the shoulder of giants, a long way of saying thank you to Karl for the work you've done. But Karl, do you want to talk for a minute about how you think about technology today?
So, well, thank you for those kind remarks, Matt, and thank you, Beth and Megan, for this terrific work that you've put forward for us to consider. It's certainly food for thought. The digital divide is a huge issue, and in the reality of the moment, it probably looms even larger than it ordinarily does. So I actually would like to step back and just make a few observations and then speak to the questions at hand. This is a very ingenious use of the data. It basically extrapolates backwards, if you can do that, from the typical summer pattern to what we might expect to see if you extend the summer for 2 or 3 months. So going from 3 months to 5 or 6, I think, in the way the graphs are laid out. And the implications of the patterns that you share with us are quite dire. I mean, we see much greater patterns of COVID loss piggybacked on the summer loss than you would see just over the summer months by themselves. What's particularly challenging about this exercise, though, is that it assumes that the 3 months out of schooling that we're in the middle of now is basically will look a lot like the typical summer period. And I'm afraid it's going to look a lot worse than that. In that there's no planning has been able to move forward in advance of this unanticipated shock to the system. And so everything's disrupted. School systems, school districts throughout the country have been scrambling to try to put together strong distance learning resources, but we know that that's a very uneven. The successes are very uneven. And of course, speaking to the issue of the digital divide, our neediest children are the ones that are least likely to have access to the internet, to be attending schools that are able to mobilize quickly and effectively to provide distance learning for them. So everything is so unsettled. We know under the old normal, the summer period, disadvantaged children tended to struggle academically and in terms of the other kinds of things that we worry about in terms of food access and safety and social-emotional learning. But at least there was a network of summer program providers in place to help some of them. You know, that system isn't large enough and its reach isn't great enough to serve all children who need our help. But that system, for all its failings, isn't available to our children now. And so sadly, I have to, this is conjectural, but I think the situation over this 6-month period for schools that don't reopen at all this year is going to look a lot worse than what your projections anticipate. That said, there are some familiar patterns in the data you shared. The math reading contrasts look very familiar to me. I mean, we have a literature that goes back quite a few years that indicates that math learning is more school dependent than reading, because lots of parents can help their kids at home develop their vocabulary and their reading comprehension and so forth. We're not as well as prepared, parents that is, to work on math skills in the same way that we can work on children with reading. The other thing I want to point out, which is quite striking here, is that the COVID slide is much more pronounced in the earlier grades than in the middle grades. That doesn't really surprise me, but I think it's worth mentioning that in general, when you get to the upper grade level, certainly in high school, but also extending down into the middle grades, test scores don't move all that much over the school year. The test score gains are not as pronounced during in the upper grades as they are in the lower grades. When you get to 7th, 8th grade, and certainly into high school, what's happened, the action is more in curriculum-based assessments. You know, kids that are studying physics or biology or woodshop, you know, are developing skills in those areas that aren't assessed by these more generic tests of reading and math. And the only other point I would make at the upper grades, a whole host of additional considerations come into play. The COVID loss is probably going to be very costly to our students in high school who ordinarily would be looking forward to apprenticeship programs or summer internships. So there are work preparation issues that are hidden from view at the moment, but are going to loom very large for many young people. And so I very much appreciate what you've done here. It's really, I think, quite compelling work, and it is food for thought. But the issues go well beyond those that you've been able to capture in your graphs.
Yeah. So Karl, thank you. And just to sort of underscore your main point there was that the actual losses this summer might even look worse than what we can predict based on data from years earlier. So a scary warning there for all of us. Beth and Megan, Karl mentioned that the loss was earliest in the younger grades, in 3rd and 4th grade. Can you talk, I presume you don't have data for kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, some of the younger grades, but some folks have been asking questions. Can you make any hypotheses about what is happening in those youngest grades or what might happen this summer?
Yeah, Map Growth actually does have data in kindergarten through 2nd grade. We didn't include it for a couple of reasons in this plot, partly just because it seemed like 6 lines was about the maximum number you could put on a plot and have anyone make any sense of it. But I do think we as Karl said, we have reason to believe the younger kids may be more affected. And I do worry a little bit even more about using the kindergarten 1st grade typical summer to represent what this might look like, because kindergarten and 1st graders are much less likely to be able to work independently and work on computers and type and interact with their teachers through any sort of devices and virtual learning than even kids by 2nd and 3rd grade who may have more we know young kids are technologically savvy in ways that we were not at that age, but it's still, in terms of typing and things like that, that's probably not a skill set that's been fully developed. So what virtual instruction looks like for those youngest kids is kind of an open question. But I do really think we have to worry a lot about these younger kids in terms of the actual academic development, because these kids in young grades are learning really fundamental foundational skills. And if you miss out on 3 months of really foundational math, it's going to be really hard to build upon that. And we know throughout elementary and middle school, it's all about building upon things you've already learned in previous grades. So I do think we have really strong reason to believe that these younger kids are going to be strongly affected. The other age range that we see, at least in terms of the typical summer loss patterns we see are kind of at risk, are fifth graders who are likely to be making a transition to middle school. And those kids, we know that's a disruptive period normally. And I think that given the disruption in the world today, it's kind of hard to know whether that will compound the normal disruption or, if it's everything's just already disruptive as it is. But the fifth grade in particular, kids transitioning from fifth to sixth grade in math seems to be the biggest concern that we would see based on the typical summer learning patterns.
Yeah. So just to highlight, math is more severe, younger grades more severe, and then those transition points from elementary into middle school. Yeah. What about other ways of thinking about students? Can we make any inferences on rural versus urban students? Students in different types of schools. Are there any other things we can talk about here?
Yeah, so far we haven't done some of those breakdowns that you mentioned. We think that there's likely, there's a cat who is dangling his tail into my screen from the beyond. So we have reason to believe that, kids who are more likely to be at a disadvantage normally will, this period of COVID crisis and COVID pandemic will just magnify and, exacerbate the existing inequalities, especially, for low-income children, for children in rural areas who are less likely to be able to have internet connection or be able to drive to the school to pick up packets if they're far away from their school. I think there's good reason to believe that those students will be more affected by by this extended school closure. But right now, we don't have direct data on that.
Yeah. Carl?
And we also, one more thought. The only other thing, I think we also have really strong reason to believe that, there are many children with special needs and who need who these technology and virtual instructions do not have the accessibility requirements that we would hope for if this was, planned in the future, if we had really had time to prepare for this. I think there are a lot of children out there who are really struggling, who normally have lots of supports in the classroom, extra adults helping with their learning, who are struggling during this period.
Yeah. And Carl, I wanted to ask you about social emotional learning. It's not reflected in this data, but how you think about, some of the other, other developmental goals and needs for kids during this long absence.
Yeah, sure. It may not be reflected in the data in an explicit way, but it will be captured in an implicit way, because this experience for many young people has been certainly quite traumatizing. And again, talk about the digital divide. There are a host of divides in our country that come into play here. So our neediest children who are at home may not have access to the kinds of learning supports that children of more privileged background have access to during this period. Their parents are likely to be extremely stressed because they're not as able to, I'm talking about low income, poverty level, needy parents. They're not able to work from home to the same extent that middle class and professional parents can work from home. So their children, there are issues about supervision and childcare. Many of these children are living in unsafe neighborhoods, so being confined to the house is limiting, but also perhaps protective. And there is a whole host of considerations that come into play here. But having to struggle through this several-month period in conditions that are stressful, highly stressful, without a strong base of social supports and resources to help both the parents and the children manage, that's most certainly expected to show up in not just their academic performance, but looking ahead, no one really knows what school will look like in the fall. It's certainly not going to be the old normal, and we don't know what the new normal is going to look like. But we need to start thinking children show up. Testing program will be able to continue. I guess that remains to be seen. But people who are responsible for looking after these children and their care and nurturing they need to know how to place them, what kinds of supplemental resources they need in the fall, not just to make up for lost time, but to help them kind of resettle and be able to be forward-looking and prepared to attend to the work at hand in school. So there's need for those kinds of assessments, not just achievement score assessments, but social-emotional well-being assessments to understand what kinds of resources are going to be needed to help these children and their parents get back into whatever the new school routine is going to look like. So these are huge issues, and we don't have anything like the NWEA testing program in place to do socio-emotional assessments well on a broad scale to help inform decision-making.
We're getting a lot of questions from folks about sort of practical and policy-related interventions, and I want to get to those. But first, one more question on Karl's last point there about the sort of assessment and testing that we might need going forward. First, on a macro level to understand what the full impact of this is in 6 or 9 or 12 months, but then also more at the classroom or student level, how can teachers and districts and programs begin to assess where kids are, when they finally get to see them again?
I can jump in there. I'm on the record, so I have to be careful what I say. We work for an assessment organization, so we're clearly a bit biased in that. But I actually think this is a time that we can kind of re-empower or empower our teachers and families and kids in a way that we haven't before. So sort of like public health has done this, I think, with this, just keeping track of the COVID epidemic and how much data can inform our decision making. I think there's a real call in education. Often data is done to teachers or done to schools or done to marginalized communities. This is a chance for us to reclaim it in ways that can be really instructionally useful. And it's not just academic. It also really is important to think about climate and social-emotional learning and the whole child. I'd also say the other piece is like kind of the silver lining, if you will, is that, schools have had to be really creative in making outreach efforts to families, and families have also been more reaching into schools.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we kind of carry those learnings over? And I think, summer learning, libraries, park and rec, these are all places that have done inroads into parent recruitment and involvement in ways that the school system could really learn from, culturally specific organizations. So this is like a call to action, I think, where we can see learnings in other education related spaces that could really drive some supports that are part of the recovery effort. And I'll also say in terms of the assessment side on kind of our traditional academic places, or measures, this is a chance to think about progress monitoring for recovery, because part of the fear is that we're going to expect, schools and teachers to make up learning ground, 2 years of loss in 3 months. And I'm just, how can we be realistic about the recovery and think about, metrics where kids are growing and hopefully growing above average, but it could still take a couple years to be making up the losses that we see, and especially for certain populations.
And particularly if the virus comes and goes and schools come and go, there's not necessarily a single endpoint here. Megan, did you want to talk about the assessments?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Beth said. And I think, this is really a chance to rethink assessment. No one assessment is going to be able to serve all the needs. It's likely that teachers and parents will need really good diagnostic assessment to really find gaps of learning and make plans for what skills got lost for an individual student, what skills students still have. There will probably be a need beyond that for policymakers, for schools to think about more holistically, how did this affect students, which students and schools need the most resources. And that's not all going to be one single test. And Karl, I think, said it really well. We need to also think about measuring social emotional learning. It's a little bit harder to measure. We haven't spent as much time and money thinking about how to measure these skills, but to me, this is really, I've seen polls where parents and practitioners and teachers have been asked what's important. And I think there's actually a unique period of time right now where people really understand the importance of testing and data, but it has to be testing done right for the right kind of purposes, which is helping students, helping schools catch up the learning, rather than using it punitively or for, just for metrics or accountability purposes. I think this is really a time in which if we have good data in the hands of teachers and parents, then we can actually, like Beth was saying, build on some of these bridges that have actually been formed while parents have more of an involvement in their learning than they may have had in previous years.
Yeah, if I could just add to that. So I think Beth is quite right. There are potentially some silver linings to what we're going through now. One, as she mentions, is that parents are more engaged. At least many parents are more engaged in their children's learning now than they've ever had to be in the past. And hopefully we can capture that and have it, channel it going forward once when school resumes in the fall, hopefully resumes in the fall. The other is the experiments that we're in the middle of with advances in digital learning. I mean, if you think there's like, how many school districts are there? There are that many experiments in digital learning. And if we can actually mobilize in a way to identify best practices, which of those experiments are really working well, which is something the skeptic in me says we may not take advantage of that, but there is an opportunity there if we do take advantage of it, to carry forward those best practices into the new normal, whatever that looks like. As you mentioned in one of your slides, the likelihood going forward is that there will be a blended approach to schooling, and there will be a need to do extended learning opportunities beyond the school hours in order to help children catch up and keep up. So being able to use the lessons that hopefully will be learned about the most effective ways to provide digital learning and the resources that are needed to support digital learning, the technical resources and the human resources to support digital learning done well, does open up some potential for creating a new and better educational system going forward.
Yeah, and I hope a part of that is a different, maybe more robust outreach to parents that really engages parents and supports them in home learning strategies during school closures like this. We're getting lots of folks asking questions and a few people offering up solutions or recommendations and resources. And I just wanted to invite folks, we're all looking for solutions. If you have ideas, enter them into the Q&A. All of this will be shared, and if there's a good resource out there, spread the word. Let's talk for a moment maybe about libraries, even in the context, or especially in the context of libraries also being closed and maybe not opening up. Have you guys any suggestions and ideas on what libraries can do to support their communities? Well, the reason I brought it up is I saw a library out here in rural Oregon that is trying to do a bookmobile and essentially bringing books to kids' homes, much the way some school districts are delivering lunches. So bringing homework packets, bringing books, meeting kids where they are.
I can offer just a few things that I've seen on our side. Our local library system here in Multnomah County also offers ways to enroll digitally. So I think people are having to pivot to recruit in different ways. Having open education resources is another way that libraries can really contribute and use, not only through kind of our local and county libraries, but also through our university systems and some of the borrowing and lending, and some of the media too. And I've also seen like creative ways of doing closed captioning on movies or TV to help get kids to reinforce reading. So I think there's different campaigns that I've seen out of some systems that are really sort of clever. And you can also link them to resources that teachers and schools are providing that you see in the summer. Okay, a kid's reading levels about this on an achievement level, but you also have Lexile. So then when you start to think about books that might support reading, that those are kind of easy ways to connect to resources that are free, which are really incredible and important right now more than ever.
So our libraries are tremendous resources in support of year-round learning, but summer learning in particular. And hopefully they'll be up and running soon, and perhaps in a way that allows walk-in services. But there is a research literature on the value that can attach to home reading programs and getting good books into the hands of parents But as Beth just mentioned, the lessons that we've learned from that are that it's not just any old book. They have to be grade level reading appropriate to the student. They have to be engaging materials. And it helps if there can be some what they call scaffolding, that is follow-up support. So outreach from parents or from librarians, outreach from teachers or librarians to parents to encourage the use of literature at home and to make that literature more broadly available is a very valuable avenue to pursue. And that could be extended into the digital world as well. It doesn't have to be the old-timey hard copy books that are being used.
We have a knowledge center at summerlearning.org that includes a variety of research briefs highlighting, for example, the more extreme losses in math that we've seen in your data, but also highlighting reading intervention programs and the strategies to support them, like you just mentioned, Karl. So those are at summerlearning.org. I think we're bumping up against some time constraints. I want to thank all of you, because my part is done, but stay where you are. Leslie is going to jump on with some additional thoughts and questions. Leslie?
Can I just take a second to put in a pitch for the National Academy of Sciences?
Of course, Karl, yes.
I don't know if you can see this, but anyway, it's a terrific resource, National Academy of Sciences committee report on shaping summertime experiences. It wasn't written in light of the COVID-19 experience, but it's very instructive and provides a broad-based overview of the summertime and its implications for children's well-being across a host of their developmental domains, and not just learning, but socio-emotional learning and like. And it's available free from the National Academies of Sciences website if you care to download it, and it's a very useful reference work for what's happening now.
I agree, Karl. I can include a link to the highlights from that in the follow-up email that I send out.
Perfect.
So there are a lot of questions that I'm seeing in the Q&A box around, I guess I'll summarize them as what should be the priority or the focus. So we're in questions saying that they normally start the program mid-June, but they're gearing up to move the start-up date, which you would recommend starting earlier. There's another question from, looks like from libraries about what sort of activities they should focus on. So any thoughts on what should be, how to prioritize, because there's so much to think about trying to address this summer, where the priorities should be?
I would say, and this isn't to duck the issue, but I think a priority needs to be mobilizing the resources to allow people with lots of good ideas to implement those ideas. There's not likely to be just one best solution moving forward. The need is great, and it's going to continue into the school year and beyond. In order to take advantage of the good ideas that are out there, we really need the resources to be able to implement programs and planning. And that can't be taken for granted. Budgets are been devastated by this. City, state budgets, and now the federal budget has blown a big hole in it with the various stimulus packages. So Matt already made reference to the resources available through NSLA. There's information at the NSLA website on best practices under normal circumstances, and I think those lessons will continue to be relevant through the period that we're in now. But resources are really going to be critical. Now, you can't do the creative, imaginative, wonderful things that you have in mind if you can't afford them. And we all need to be talking to, engaged with our local school district and our local states to encourage the investments that will need to be made in helping our children recover from this horrible circumstance.
I think I'd also add just that the social emotional support, the summer is going to be messy regardless of all of our efforts, our best efforts. So just making sure that children have and families have that social emotional support that they need to make sure that they know that they're still connected to the programs or schools or community is really important. So we had a question about just readjusting expectations for students. Should we be considering what students will need holistically and what we can consider typical academic trajectories? And let me-
I can try to chime in there. What some of the planning that we've been thinking about to support our districts is we are working in big systems, and so thinking about kind of realistic goals and measures. I think there's part of it of kind of trying to understand how bad is the damage is kind of a first step, and where we have Swiss cheese when we return. So how big are those holes, and where do we go fill them, and getting really useful information there. I think then there's the tactical about curriculum decisions and how much on prior grade content our teachers going to have to teach to kids. How does that also play out in a real classroom with instructional variation? Will be a difficult task, already daunting for teachers, but likely exacerbated this fall or when kids return. And so I think there's, you can see how kids are performing now relative to how they would typically perform, or like some kind of normative measure. There's also how that kid has performed to how they've typically performed in the past. So I actually think using multiple measures to contextualize a realistic recovery plan for kids is important, and it's probably not a one size fits all. Some kids are going to need less recovery, if you will, but should still be given opportunities to learn. And then there's some kids that are going to have massive recovery, and how do we kind of prioritize resources in the ways that best support them and catch up and success. I guess my biggest fear, I have kids, so it's like this could be a COVID generation if we don't take it seriously. And so thinking about the long game and how we support kids through trauma, social emotional, academic, out of school time, bring different institutions in which financially I know is going to be really tough, but it's this sort of moral imperative I think that lies on our shoulders at the moment, to really hopefully support the kids in the best way we can.
Is there any way for OSU organizations and programs to get access to assessments that tell us where children are having issues in math and reading, if they want to offer tutoring programs that are personalized to the student?
That's not a short answer. It depends. There's all different ways. So some organizations that work directly with school systems can do data sharing agreements, especially with the larger systems. Those tend to be ways that you can have districts, for example, de-identify and send data back. The more that you have kind of PII, that can be a bit more difficult, but working within school districts tends to be a good way to support that, or through even other organizations at the government or LEA level is a way to get access to data too.
Okay, thanks. I knew it was going to be a difficult question to ask anyways. If all factors are even, equity and digital access, et cetera, how will virtual learning itself affect learning trends? Any thoughts on that? Sorry, should I repeat the question?
I'm going to give you a non-evidence-based response. I don't think virtual or digital learning is an effective substitute for in the classroom, around the table, working with a real human teacher. So we may be able to make great advances in how to extend the reach of the school into the home through digital or virtual mechanisms, but I can't imagine that those innovations will displace the need for schools and classrooms and teachers to be on hand. So that's why if looking forward, we want to be able to mobilize those innovations and best practices, but incorporate them into schooling as we've come to understand what it looks like.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Is this data being shared with parents in any organized way? Are there thoughts on how you might share this with parents?
Megan's been on the roadshow of media, so if parents attend or they watch CNN or listen to NPR, some of that information is getting out in kind of the larger public forum. But we have actually done a presentation for the National PTA, so we're working on it. There's this dance too, and I think Karl alluded to it earlier, where we don't want to frighten the public, but we also want the public to know, right? So there's this idea of kind of how do we inform, how do we think about flattening the curve or reducing the slope in this case, but also, the burden is going to fall disproportionately on parents and teachers, and these are not necessarily the folks that are going to have all the resources to actually meet the variety of needs that we have. And so I think we're trying to figure out, what is the recovery or the messaging that we can do that's solutioning, rather than, here's just shock of data, and these are projections too, right? They're projections that are based on evidence, but hopefully won't be fully realized.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again to our panel, to Matthew, Karl, Megan, Beth. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. I just want to wrap up with a couple announcements. We have more to come in our Voices of Summer webinar series. This Thursday will be a webinar on summer youth employment. And then next week, we have one on arts on Tuesday. And then next Thursday, actually, we will be continuing this conversation exploring the impact of COVID-19 on the future of summer learning. So we'll hear some more about a recent survey that was done of educators to get their opinion on how to make up this time. We'll also hear from some programs in the school district and another community-based organization on how they are addressing this summer and adapting their program to help address this summer. We're also looking forward to National Summer Learning Week coming up in July 6th through 11th. This is a great time to celebrate summer, everything summer. It will be a week where we're looking at different aspects of summer and different themes around STEM and arts and literacy. So it's going to look a little different this year, but we're still planning to celebrate, and we hope that you will join us. I'll also mention that we are still planning our conference for the fall. As of now, we're still going to be in DC, November 16th through the 18th. So we look forward to having you join us for that as well. Finally, if you're not following us on social media, here's our social media different tags. Please follow us to hear the latest announcements and events as they're coming out. And again, thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. We will be in touch. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.